Our last two speakers are our O'Neill Center's own Rick Alm and Michael Cox. I'll let them sort of quickly segue from one to the other, and then after that we'll conclude with our luncheon. Thanks.
Jamie, where's, oh, here he is. Thank you. All right. I'm going to try to do the impossible. I'm going to try to take you through 200 years of Texas economic history in 20 to 25 minutes. So without further ado, we're going to move on. All right. Let's start today in the present. Texas, of course, is famous for being an economic juggernaut. If you look at GDP growth, we are well above the U.S. and other big cities. And if you look at employment, a very similar story. And if you believe that people vote with their feet, you see that except for Florida, which has a disproportionate amount of older people coming in, we also are getting those foot votes to come in and that our economy is working. So, Pastor's prologue question is why? Why has the Texas economy outperformed the rest of the nation for at least most of the last 2 decades? Well, if you ask Governor Abbott, if you ask Michael Cox here, you'll get some version of the answer that it's the Texas model. It combines low taxes, small government, support for the private sector by the state government, and we at the O'Neill Center have a way of measuring and comparing states. We call this model economic freedom. And Dean Stanzel's here somewhere. He puts this together. And so we can measure how different Texas is than the rest of the nation in terms of its basic economic orientation towards the private sector versus the government. And this is what the results are since 1980. And you can see that Texas is not always the number one in economic freedom, but it has a long history of being one of the most economically free states. So, and one more preliminary, I want to give you a framework for how I'm going to look at the evolution of this. I chose evolution as a very, very purposely because this is what Joseph Schumpeter thinks, it's how he regards economic progress. It's an evolutionary process. And it starts because you have a lot of economic change that comes out of new methods, new methods of production, new forms of industrialization, new everything. The new comes along and replaces the old. And so I'm going to tell you a story of how technologies have moved Texas from one economic era to another. The famous phrase is, of course, creative destruction. A little note on geography. We know where we are in the world, but this is where we were earlier on, is that we were isolated if you start in 1820. The land is flat, so it makes good for farmland, but you have short and shallow rivers, which means it makes transportation expensive, but you also have a lot of mineral resources, and of course, we're going to talk very much about one of them, oil. All right, so about 1821, I chose 1821 because that was the year in which Mexico won its independence from Spain, and Texas went from being a province of New Spain to a province of Mexico. We were the northernmost one, and about 7,000 people lived in all of Texas, and they basically made their livelihoods by subsistence farming. Trade was negligible because the markets were in central Mexico and the northeast of the United States, and there was few roads and infrastructures and ships. Everything was slow and expensive. And around there you had the challenge of protecting the frontier from indigenous tribes who viewed the Mexican settlers as a, well, economic asset that could be exploited. So, all right. So, first aspect of Texas economic evolution is cotton. See, the Mexicans had a problem. There weren't enough people up here in Texas to support a garrison. There wasn't enough people in Texas to keep the Americans from coming into this area because they wanted land. So what they decided to do in an act of pure desperation is they decided to open Texas to Anglo settlers. And so, and the lure, of course, was land. You could, a head of a household could get 4,500 acres, 4,600 acres, just pay $184, and you've got 6 years to pay that. Now, if you think about the settlement of the Midwest, that was done differently, right? There were caps on the amount of land you could have. The land was more expensive. And so you didn't end up with these large land holdings, and that will become important later when we talk about cattle. What's the technology? The technology was the Industrial Revolution, right? In England was textile mills in Manchester and other cities have created an enormous demand for cotton, which pushed cotton farmers into the American South, and all that way, once Texas was opened, that wave of migration just continued in this way. Most of the early Texas settlers came from the Old South, and that many were cotton farmers. So cotton was a cash crop, but it brought with it Texas's deal with the devil, slavery. All right. What happens next is Texas turns northward. We achieve independence and then statehood. Now, this is a big step towards economic freedom, because what we've done is we've left a country that was unstable and inward-looking, and we joined the most dynamic economic force for the next 150 years. If you look at economic freedom today, this is what Bob does over there, is at nation level, and U.S. ranks number 5, and Mexico ranks number 76, and economic freedom is highly correlated with economic success, and you can see the difference in per capita income. So here's what cotton did. We found out that Texas' basic role for its first 150 years is to supply raw materials to feed the capitalist engine. And the technology driver was outside the state. And if economics drives policy, what happened was the political center of gravity went towards the wealthy cotton farmers who were slave owners. And so the primary issue of both Texas independence and Texas statehood was slavery. And we can't get around that. Now, in time, of course, cotton is no longer the driving force of the Texas economy. But what Schumpeter tells us is that these industries that are passed by don't necessarily die. They adapt, and with technology, and they survive. And now cotton is now a small part of Texas's economy, but Texas is the #1 cotton growing state in the United States. All right, so cattle comes next. All right, so we had to fight, because we were a slave state, we had to fight the Civil War, and we lost, right? So all these soldiers came back from the Civil War and found a ruined economy. What they did is they just developed a new industry. And they did it by taking advantage of two things that were already there from the Mexican days. #1 was their wild cattle. These are the longhorns they're so famous. And this cowboy heritage. The Mexican vaqueros, they were excellent at herding cattle, and these skills were transformed into the Anglo culture that was growing there. And again, there's a demand for beef. But the problem, because again, the rest of the world's getting richer, especially the northeast of the United States. They can afford to buy beef now. But how do you get it there? It turns out that the technology solves this problem of distance and isolation. Once the railroads move towards into Kansas and Abilene, Dodge cities, the Texans invented a form of technology, the cattle drive. This is a tremendously complex operation, getting 6,000 or 7,000 cows over 400 to 500, 600 miles through bad weather. The organizational skills are immense. We should teach this at the Cox School of Business, right? But it was a railroad that created the cattle industry. And you can see that in 1860 we only had a few railroads down by the coast, and they spread up by 81, and by 1909. In other words, the railroads came to Texas, and it changed a lot. Now, Texas lured those railroads the way the rest of the country did. We gave away stuff, right? Bonds, loans from government. This was not necessarily a free market enterprise. And they gave away a lot of land and things. Now, but what the arrival of railroads did economically is it allowed Texas to capture some of the downstream activities. And the best example is Fort Worth, where in 1887 they created stockyards to buy and sell cattle, and then that was the first step. That activity used to be done in Chicago or St. Louis, but now it was done closer to home. Then the meat packers came down and started dressing the cattle down here in the early 1900s. And in the same process, Dallas became a center for cotton trading and finance. But again, that had less to do with the railroads maybe, but more to do with the telephones and telegraphs. In other words, these technologies allowed these ancillary industries to come to Texas. Now, the other thing that's interesting of this time is that Texas created the Texas Railroad Commission. And basically, it took about 20 years to get the politics right, but early 1890s, I put James Hogg up there because he named his daughter I'm a Hog, so, you know. So, and you can't pass that one up. Anyway, the commission had the oversight of the railroad industry and set rates and to protect consumers from unfair prices. This is a very Elizabeth Warren kind of thing, isn't it? Right? But this arose out of an agrarian populism that reveals the political clout is no longer in the slave cotton and slave community. It's in the farmers and ranchers. And this is very typical of what was happening all the way to the north in the Midwest because you're getting these kinds of pro-consumer, pro-farmer legislations. So, continues the supply of raw materials. Technological still came from the outside the state. And another interesting thing is that we imported a lot of capital because investors from Europe, everybody's buying cattle farms, huge cattle farms. And then the agriculture interests, and again, the same pattern with cotton is you get eclipsed, but you're still with us, and you'll get the new thing. A gusher of gushers. This is in 1901, Spindletop, and then in that set up the oil industry in the Gulf Coast, and then you moved over to that's the next. Anyway, and the technology of drilling improved. Yes, that's part of it. But the biggest impetus for what was going on and what made the oil valuable and worth getting out of the ground was the huge technological advances in transportation, including the automobile and non-coal burning trains. And these transportation, that created the great demand for Texas oil and created all the fortune. So, problem was we got to be too good at it. There was too much oil here, so we had overproduction. And so in the 30s, East Texas was the I love this picture of Kilgore. This was the front, the Main Street. So prices up, production up. Basic economics. But then the state stepped in. Very peculiar thing for a free market mecca. The Texas Railroad Company just said that they had this little commission, and they said, "Oh, you guys handle oil too," and big companies went along with it. Not surprisingly, higher prices, higher profits. And this, of course, was a model for OPEC. So, now, there's some similarities between the cotton and cattle episodes with this, with oil. But now you have one of the things you see coming in this new era is indigenous entrepreneurs. You see urbanization and industry come along. You see downstream products, but also upstream, plus seedlings and sequels. Right? In other words, this is spurring a whole bunch of ancillary activity. And then the last thing is the state's politics forge an identity that differs from the nation. Right? We were like the South during the cotton era. We were like the Midwest during the cattle era, agrarian era. Now we're going to be different from the rest of the United States. So there's some of the indigenous entrepreneurs. And of particular note is those 4 oil barons. These are the 4 guys most often mentioned in terms of becoming very powerful Texas figures in Texas politics. Now, let me area us a little bit on you see the fantastic growth rates of Houston, almost 60, 70, 50, 60, 50, almost 60%, things were happening, right? And the manufacturing came, first it was, the energy, but once you had the energy factory, making things for energy, then you had labor, and other manufacturers can come by. You're starting to diversify the economy. And the seedlings I caught are the little I call those the things like Neiman Marcus, without oil, without oil wealth. And then there's Second Acts, that's a sequel. That's like TI came out of the oil industry, but it has nothing to do with the oil industry. So there's a lot of things going on because of that. But most importantly for our question is you have a new center of gravity for politics. And slaveholders gave way to agricultural interests, now the oil barons, right? So as we entered the 1900s, right before the discovery of oil down in Spindletop, Texas was decidedly progressive, agrarian populism. After the 1920s, the political influence goes towards the oilmen, and they want low taxes, small government, pro-business. They want anti-union. Right-to-work legislation was born in Texas. And this looks a lot like the Texas model I showed you, right? So, let's see what's interesting here. Oilmen empowered. Without oil, we'd look a lot like Kansas and Nebraska, right? So, one last thing happens, right? 1970s were a fabulous time to be in Texas. Money was sloshing around like crazy. OPEC, oil shocks were great for Texas. But the 80s were terrible because oil prices fell and the Texas economy collapsed. There's some numbers there. 252,000 jobs, about 4% of jobs were gone in 1 year. And then they took down the banking and the real estate industries suffered, right? So, and this is how it looks. You can see the volatility in the, so you had a period of low prices and rising output, high prices and flat output, and then you're seeing at the end there, you're having another spike in the, and you had low prices, flat output, and then you have so-so prices, but rising output. We're back in another oil boom now. But here's what really happened. Here's the story of the last 30 years. You'll see during the 90s, oil prices are low, right? But what's happening is that Texas is growing like mad. All these high bars in the 90s and going into the 2000s. That's what's happening. Is Texas economy is rapidly diversifying away from oil. So. It's 1962 for electronic data system. Diversification was already underway. In some way, some new industries were coming out, and then one reason why we could diversify so fast is we didn't have to grow everything from the ground up. Texas has been very successful in bringing some very big companies from other places in the world. And this is another aspect of economic freedom. Companies want to come here and take advantage of this healthy business climate, or as what we call economic freedom. And here's a good way this is a very detailed chart on, you can see if you look at the 1963s, manufacturing and mining. In other words, the things were higher on this end, but if you look in 2018, those are all lower, and the ones that are going up are the green bars on the right. And these are professional business, services, healthcare, finance, information, all these things. These are the knowledge-based industries. So, more like the nations. And so anyway, the test of this diversification came in 2014. You had an oil price drop almost exactly the same magnitude of what happened in the 80s. The oil industry suffered. Houston didn't enjoy that time. But the rest of the state continued to grow as if, in other words, it wasn't a repeat of the 1980s. And our risks today are generally outside of the state. Trade policy, Mexico's politics, and things like that. Climate change, immigration. These are what we should be worried about now, not low oil prices. So, all right, so the question that I posed is, where did this Texas model come from? Well, if you look to the southeast, didn't seem to come from there, because those on our economic freedom of North America, you don't have much economic freedom. All those are in those formerly cotton-producing states are still at the tail end, towards the tail end of economic freedom. Well, if you look at economic freedom in the Midwest, when we used to be like them, well, they're better than the old South, but they're not as good as Texas. So my tentative hypothesis, you can talk me out of it if you want, is that the oil barons are what steered this state to the successful Texas model. Then if you think about the future, because I just told you that oil is getting less important in this state. So a legitimate thing to think about is whether the emerging clout in Texas is political is going to be with urban elites, just like the rest of the country, right? And will they continue to support and preserve the Texas model? That's an interesting question, but I'm not going to answer it for you. That's it. Thank you. Now this is Mike Cox, who worked with me on this. All those charts, all those pretty charts you saw up there, he did them.
This year, we produced our 10th annual report in a series we began when we started the O'Neill Center back in 2009. We looked kind of go back and forth between annual topics and local topics, starting with the ascension of DFW. This year, we're focusing on big business, the reemergence of the American oligopolies in society, but asking, are they different now? Because these are knowledge age oligopolies. These little bubbles are getting bigger, are intended to be mergers and acquisitions into large companies. That's the art we're trying to get across here. Ever since Alfred Marshall's book, Principles of Economics in 1890, the main drawings that economists have been using in their work is supply and demand. Downward sloping demand curves and price space, and upward sloping supply curves. Supply curve slopes upward because fixed costs aren't that large. Rising marginal costs get worse and worse as you try to produce more output, especially in the short run. So we have, upward sloping supply curves, downward sloping demand curves. In that space, and if it's like that, a shift in demand increases prices, and that's what we're used to. We can't produce more without charging you more to cover the increasing cost. That's been economics for 120 years. But what if demand curves, supply curves didn't slope upward? What if they slope downward? Then an increase in demand could actually lower prices. Is that just some kind of fantasy make-believe thing, or might that be happening in an increasing share of the economy today? Let's look. Well, first think about pills, for example. Average cost of bringing a new pill to market is $2.5 billion. Marginal cost is 15 to 35 cents. If you look at the book on it, I've looked at it. And so it's a world where the more you sell, the less you can charge. If you sell one pill, it's $2.5 billion. You can sell 10 billion and 25 cents will cover the average fixed cost, and then you got the marginal cost of the pill becomes cheap. You need more demand, not less, in order to get to cheaper prices. It's not just that way for pills. As Larry Summers said, a knowledge-based world is one in which more of the goods produced will have the characteristics of pharmaceuticals or drug companies in that they have large fixed costs and smaller marginal costs. And that's the world I want you to think about today. Large fixed cost and small marginal cost. I don't have the time to go into all the many, many industries which are like that, but you're able to go to a movie that costs $250 million, $450 million to produce for $12 because other people go too. We all contribute to paying the fixed cost. And the bigger the global audience, as you can see here, the bigger the budget we can have, and still without prices going up. You're able to have this miracle of markets for a couple $100, an iPhone 8 basic model for $250 because so many other people own cell phones, whereas in the past, very few did. There were other course reasons why the technology has evolved, but it has evolved to serve a growing global audience because we can sell this to so many people. So what we're saying here is that there's a lot of industries like this today which have declining average cost over a long range of output. Okay, firms that are like that, and the collection of those firms becomes an industry with 2 or 3 firms or 4 firms in it. If you assume, and you don't have to do this, but let's just take an easy case, that firms decide to price their product at, say, 25% above average cost. So you take the price, subtract the average cost divided by the price. If that's the way these firms in an oligopoly decide to price, and it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, this is very complex. But if it is, then you will see the supply curve lie everywhere above the 25% above the average cost curve, which means that when the demand increases, prices fall. We can sell more. And this changes everything about what we think we know and about how an economy operates. So what? Well, what does it change? Well, of course, it changes things for consumers. It means that we have a rising gap between what you and I have to pay for something, like email, nothing, and how much it's worth to us, or the internet, or our phones, or so on. It means products spread faster through the population today, from the first people to get it, the rich to the poor. It means we have less inequality in consumption. And I'm just teasing you here. That's just a few of the things it means. I have a list of 20 things this means. Here are 9 of them. It means in businesses that we see more concentration, more mergers and disruption of the small businesses disappearing, excess profits, higher returns on capital, greater incentive to create entry barriers, though, of the surviving firms. It also means in terms of economy and policy that GDP is undermeasured. Inflation is overmeasured. We have more inequality in income, even starting within the firm, from how much the CEOs of these big companies make compared to your other workers. And it also means rising antitrust concerns for government, even if they're not justified, because these aren't really monopolies or oligopolies in the standard sense. Everybody wants Google. They're not being forced into it. That's where they choose to go. So for consumers, it's just a little evidence. You see the faster spread of products into American households today than in the past. We've shown this before. Looking at, for example, it took 61 years for 2/3 of Americans to get a telephone from the time it first came out, and the first person had it in 1892, but it only took 16 for 2/3 of the population to get the internet. And this whole list of products is happening much faster than in the past. That's just some of the evidence we present in the report. Business